So today, I went to study CPU connections and power supplies. That's the heading: CPUs, connections, and power supplies. And right now, I'm in CPUs. And looking at the characteristics of CPUs, um, it goes over lots of different characteristics of different CPUs, the processors, the history of Intel, and the history of AMD processors, and then also um, different um, modern, they call it modern features for the x86 processors. So, or even if you look at the 64-bit architecture, also different features that enhancements that they have. Um, so my name is Keith, the IT teaching guy, and pretty much I am just teaching you what I'm learning along the way, going from fast food to IT, well, hopefully to get an IT job, and to teach you about the day-to-day things in the IT job, and teach you about what certifications I'm going to get there. So right now I'm working on the A+ certification, and just going through the information for the first test, and then by the end of January here, I'll be able to take the first test and pass that test, and then study through February for the second test and get that certification. And we'll see what kind of job I can maybe get with the certification. Otherwise, during that time, I'm going to also be studying next for the Networking Plus certification, and just keep getting them. Going through the A+ certification, Network Plus certification, getting the and then going to Microsoft and getting a few different Microsoft certifications. I want to learn about the Windows operating system, and I'll probably get the Windows 7 operating system, because Windows 8, it's just, it doesn't seem to be there yet. So, especially for the business world. So going for Windows 8 certification, and then Server 2012. So I'll learn a little bit about networks, and then a little about servers, and then the operating system, and see what kind of help desk job I can get, or working with servers and things like that. And my goal is to get at least 40,000 a year, which is about like $20 an hour. So we'll just go from there and see how things go. But for today, we're going to go over CPU characteristics. And let's go into Google, as we always do. And here in Google, I got different CPUs. And you can see their little square die that goes into the motherboard, and helps with many of the functions of your computer. CPU is almost in charge of all of the functions, and unless you have a separate GPU, graphics processor, the graphics is actually built onto most CPUs nowadays for doing graphics as well. Unless you get a really nice graphics card, then that'll just be for that. So alright, we'll start off. CPU speed is measured in megahertz and in gigahertz, and so most of it is in gigahertz now. We're pretty fast, almost up to around 4 gigahertz or more for modern CPUs. They have something called the front side bus, or FSB, is a connection between the CPU and the memory controller. That's all they gave for that, really. In addition to standard CPU functions, modern x86 processors feature several enhancements. So I'm going to go over a few of those enhancements. An enhancement called MMX, or 3D Now, is a microcode instructions that x86 CPUs use to improve performance of multimedia applications and connections. Okay, and that's all they gave me for that. So we have MMX or 3D Now. And MMX is for Intel, and 3D Now is for AMD. So you can look up that if you want. And that's an enhancement for processors today. Another enhancement is simultaneous multi-threading. And so for Intel, it's called hyper-threading technology, and AMD is called hyper-transport. And they said simultaneous multi-threading, or SMT, is the ability of a single processor core to process more than one thread. So it can do multiple threads at one time. So that's pretty cool. Next, they went through throttling. Throttling is a method of the CPU running at a lower speed and or voltage than design specifications. So you're slowing the CPU down to save voltage, I guess, or to lower the speed. Maybe it's you don't need that much speed, I guess. So there's throttling. Overclocking is a method of running the CPU at a higher speed. So there's throttling, which is lower, and then there's overclocking, which is increasing the speed. You run it at a higher speed and or voltage than design specifications. That's called overclocking. Another enhancement is multi-core CPUs. Multi-core processors have more than one CPU on the same processor die. So now they have dual core, triple or quad core. I think it can have all the way up to 6 cores right now on a single die or CPU. And that's different. They want to make a distinction. All of these cores are on, like if you see on the screen here, you have the square, and they have 6 cores on just that single die, that single CPU. But the difference is, say if you had a couple of these CPUs, a couple of these chips on your motherboard, well, like 2 of those would be a multi-processor system, having more than one CPU socket on the motherboard. So that would be multiple CPU instead of multi-core CPU. So there's a little bit difference there. Try not to get confused with that. Next, they went over a little bit on virtualization, and some Intel and AMD processors support virtualization. So you'd have to go into your BIOS and look at that, or check that out and see if your CPU supports the virtualization. So when you're running virtualization software, your CPU can actually help with that. So, and then that's all they really gave for that. So next, another enhancement to CPUs is 64-bit CPUs. Most CPUs were 32-bit. Even though 64-bit's been around for a long time, 64-bit has finally been common now for just the consumers. So 64-bit CPUs allow us at allow use of larger registers, address buses, and data buses. And they're going to talk about what an address bus is and a data bus. So they're going through, it says larger address buses, okay, allow CPUs to use more RAM. Okay, so you have a larger range for more RAM to be used at one time. And a larger data bus allows more information to be processed at one time. So more data to be coming in at one time. Next, they went over CPU cache. CPU cache, or what they call L1, L2, or L3 cache, is a static memory that is super fast. It's the memory that the CPU uses to store instructions while it works with them. Typically, there's an L1 to L3 cache, depending on your computer, processor, motherboard. And a lot of those L1, L2, or L3 cache is built on the CPU or the motherboard. But L1 is the fastest cache, and that's on the CPU itself. Next I went over GPU, or Graphics Processing Unit, and that today is also either integrated on the CPU or the motherboard. Um, so unless you get your own graphics card, it can already be just a general graphics to handle certain things on your motherboard or CPU. So it says allowing the CPU to perform other tasks. So your graphics processor, what it does is renders graphics. And so if you have a processing unit just to do that, then your CPU can be free to do other tasks for the computer. And then you just have a dedicated graphics unit, which is good. So two main processors, let's see, they went over Intel and AMD. So going through, I'm not going to go through all of the history. You can just type in on Google, like history of Intel processors, and that's kind of what I did. And you see all of the different processors here. And you're like, why do they look so weird? That's kind of what it looks like, I guess. Maybe like under a microscope or something. That I'm not sure, but I think it's really close. Like stuff that you can't see with the human eye. Like here you can see the chip, and that's what it looks like close up. It's like a city in that chip. How they lay it out and everything like that. So you can look at the history of the chips. Let's see here. Oh, it's not gonna let me do anything there. Okay, so I'm gonna zoom in a little bit, and you can see like all of like just that chip. You know, you can see so much. They pack so much stuff in these chips. You know, it's like a city. Having the multi cores, the cache memory, the processors, the graphics, all these different things are different things like that. Multiple cores. So going through Intel, you know, through the history of Intel, and you can look in the bottom here, and they'll tell you that. Zoom down, like through the history, you know, what each picture represents, like 2010, 2012, Intel Core processors, all the way back to Intel 4004 processor, 1971. So that's a long time ago, and so we've come a long way, and things have changed a lot. And you can actually go online and look at all this information about the history of Intel, the history of AMD, their processors that compete with Intel's processors, starting from the Pentium Pro all the way to the Sandy Bridge, and then going from that's for Intel, and then for AMD going from the K6 all the way to K10 processors. So you can look up that and check that out for yourself. Like I said, well, this is more for my learning, and if you pick up something from it, that's great. But I suggest going to freeaplus.com and checking out those free videos there that will help you get through the A+ test. They'll help you get through the networking test. All the information is free, and so I'm very thankful to get to use that resource as well. But I used to go to University of Phoenix Online, and so I actually have an account there to where I can just learn different certifications there for free. So that's actually a nice thing for me. So that's what I'm doing currently. So, well, thank you guys for listening, and keep studying.